Have you ever been asked to give up your place, not just a seat, but your dignity simply because someone else believed they deserved it more? On a late-night flight, a black CEO took his rightful seat, only to face a demand that he move for a white woman. What began as a simple request quickly spiraled into a shocking confrontation, exposing not just prejudice in the sky, but the fragile line between silence and justice. Imagine being told move, or risk being thrown off the plane. Would you stay firm, knowing the cost, or surrender just to avoid conflict? This isn't just a story about one passenger. It's about every moment in life when we're pressured to shrink ourselves, to yield when we've done nothing wrong. And it forces us to ask, if you were sitting in that seat, what choice would you make? Join us as we step into a journey where one phone call shifted the balance of power, where dignity became non-negotiable, and where the fight for respect reached cruising altitude. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. It was one of those busy Mondays where travelers shuffled quickly, coffee cups in hand, voices blending into a low hum across the terminal. Businessmen with laptops, families wrangling strollers, college students dragging oversized backpacks, everyone rushing to their gates. Among them walked Elias Carter, 42 years old, tall and composed, wearing a simple navy suit with no tie. His face was calm, though his eyes carried a kind of quiet determination. Most people who saw him would have never guessed Elias was the founder and CEO of a rapidly growing financial tech company. He had spent the last 15 years building it from the ground up. Today, however, he wasn't traveling as a CEO. He was just another passenger, boarding a flight to San Francisco for a week of meetings. He held a plain black duffel bag, nothing flashy. At the coffee kiosk earlier, he had smiled politely when the barista mispronounced his name, replying softly, "It happens all the time." That was Elias, never one to make a scene. But beneath his calm surface lived a man shaped by years of small battles, little slights, doors closed quietly in his face, meetings where his ideas were ignored until repeated by someone else. Elias had long learned how to move past the sting without letting it consume him. He believed in dignity, in keeping one's balance even when the world tried to shake it. As the boarding announcement echoed, he joined Group 2, scanning his phone at the gate. The beeping light turned green. A small relief. He walked down the jet bridge, feeling the familiar chill of conditioned air as he stepped into the cabin. Inside, the smell of coffee mixed with that faint metallic scent of airplanes. The crew smiled routinely. A flight attendant in his 30s, name tag Tom Bradley, gestured toward the aisle. "Welcome aboard." Elias made his way to row 14. His seat was 14A, the window. He slid his duffel bag into the overhead bin, adjusted his jacket, and sat down. From his seat, he could see the wing stretching outside the window, white against the morning sky. For a brief moment, he felt at peace. He thought of the week-ahead presentations, a dinner with investors, maybe time to walk by the bay if the schedule allowed. That peace, however, lasted less than a minute. A woman's voice cut through the steady murmur of boarding passengers. "Excuse me, you're in my seat." Elias looked up. Standing before him was a white woman, about 50, dressed in a beige blazer and pearl earrings. Her lips were tight, her eyes sharp with annoyance. Her boarding pass was clutched in one hand, a designer tote in the other. He answered with a polite smile, "This is 14A. I believe it's mine. Here's my boarding pass." She glanced at it, frowned, and shook her head. "Well then, switch with me. I shouldn't have to sit back there. She pointed toward row 27 far behind. The request hung in the air. Passengers nearby slowed their steps, some pretending not to listen, others openly watching. Elias stayed calm, his voice even. I paid for this seat. I'd like to remain here. The woman's eyes narrowed. Her name, as he would soon learn, was Margaret Hill. But in that moment, she was simply a stranger, demanding he move. She leaned closer, whispering yet loud enough for others to hear. Don't make this difficult. Just be decent and give it up. Inside. Elias felt a familiar conflict rising. Part of him wanted to just switch, avoid trouble, keep the peace. Another part of him, the part that had endured years of subtle dismissals, whispered firmly, no, not this time. He looked out the window for a moment, grounding himself. The wing outside gleamed in the sunlight, strong and steady. When he turned back, his answer was simple. Ma'am, with respect, I'm keeping my seat. Margaret drew back, lips pursed, eyes flashing with irritation. She didn't move. Instead, she turned sharply toward the aisle. Flight attendant. Over here. Tom Bradley returned, clipboard in hand, his smile thinner now. What seems to be the issue? Margaret wasted no time. This man is sitting in my seat. He refuses to move. Elias lifted his boarding pass calmly. This is 14A, my assigned seat. Tom's eyes flicked quickly between the two, then settled on Elias. His tone carried an edge of authority. Sir, perhaps you could switch seats with the lady. It would make things easier for everyone. There it was, the subtle pressure, not an order, not yet, but a nudge, a signal that peace meant Elias giving up his place. The cabin around them hushed slightly, ears tilting toward the tension. Elias held the boarding pass steady. I'd prefer to stay where I'm assigned. Tom's expression hardened. Sir, let's not create a problem here. Margaret folded her arms, satisfaction flickering across her face. She expected compliance. After all, wasn't it easier to yield? But Elias sat still, his voice low but firm. I'm not creating a problem. I'm simply taking the seat I paid for. Inside, his heartbeat was steady, but his mind wrestled. Am I making this worse? Or am I finally drawing the line that should have been drawn long ago? The aisle grew crowded as passengers piled up, waiting for the conflict to resolve. Some avoided eye contact. A few exchanged knowing glances. One young woman, seated 2 rows behind, quietly raised her phone. Recording. The stage was set. What began as a routine flight was already tilting toward something larger. Elias didn't know it yet. But within hours, this moment, this refusal to move, would ignite a chain of events that shook not only the cabin, but the entire airline itself. The air inside the cabin grew heavy, not from the recycled oxygen, but from the silence of people pretending not to listen. The boarding line slowed behind Margaret Hill, her tote bag brushing against the knees of a man seated in 13C. She didn't notice or didn't care. Her attention was locked on Elias Carter, who remained seated, his posture upright, his boarding pass still resting between 2 fingers, like a quiet declaration. Margaret's voice rose half an octave. You're refusing to cooperate, she announced, not only to Elias but to everyone within earshot. I shouldn't have to deal with this kind of disrespect. Not on a Monday morning. The man in 13 shifted uncomfortably, looking toward the aisle. Across from Elias, a teenager removed her earbuds, watching intently. Phones glowed faintly as more passengers recorded discreetly. Tom Bradley leaned in, lowering his voice but not his tone. Sir, It would be easier for everyone if you just switch. We need to keep boarding moving. The lady has made a request. Elias lifted his eyes toward Tom. There was no anger in them, just a depth that suggested he had lived this scene in other forms many times before. He spoke slowly. Each word weighed. I hear what you're saying. But I'm in the seat that matches my ticket. This isn't a request I need to comply with. Margaret scoffed loudly. Typical. Absolutely typical. She shook her head and muttered, Entitlement these days. Unbelievable. Elias felt the sting, not in the words themselves, but in the way they slid out with such casual venom, as if his very presence in 14A was a kind of theft. For a flicker of a moment, he considered the easier road standing, moving to row 27, letting the irritation pass like so many times before. But then he thought of his daughter, 11 years old, who once asked him, Daddy, why do you always say sorry, even when it's not your fault? He couldn't give her another example of yielding. Not today. The boarding line backed up further. A man in business attire cleared his throat impatiently, but no one moved. All eyes, whether openly or through stolen glances, stayed locked on the standoff. Tom straightened. His voice was more official now. Rehearsed. Sir, if you continue to refuse a reasonable request, I may have to escalate this to the captain. We cannot delay departure. Margaret crossed her arms, her pearls catching the cabin light. This isn't complicated, she said sharply. He just needs to move. Why should I be the one inconvenienced I have important meetings too? Her tone carried an assumption that her time, her schedule, her comfort weighed more than his. Elias felt the knot in his chest tighten, not with rage, but with the weary recognition of an old pattern. He inhaled slowly, the smell of jet fuel faint through the window beside him. Then he replied, steady and low, respectfully, this isn't about convenience. This is my seat. I will not be moving. The firmness in his voice drew a few raised eyebrows nearby. A young woman with braided hair in row 15 glanced at her friend, whispering, Good for him. Margaret's cheeks flushed. She turned to the line of passengers behind her, fishing for allies. Can you believe this? I've been flying for 30 years. Never once has someone refused to switch with me when I asked politely. But the word politely rang hollow in the way she spat it out, drenched in entitlement. Elias kept his gaze forward, neither challenging nor retreating. His internal voice spoke louder than the surrounding noise. Hold steady. Don't rise. Dignity is quiet, not loud. Tom scribbled something on his clipboard, eyes darting quickly across the cabin. We'll sort this out, he said tersely. Ma'am, please wait a moment while I check with the captain. Margaret huffed but didn't move, standing firm in the aisle as though the space itself was owed to her. As Tom disappeared toward the front, Elias felt the heat of dozens of eyes pressing on him. The teenager across the aisle raised her phone higher now, no longer hiding the recording. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair tapped something into his tablet, shaking his head. Margaret leaned closer, her voice sharp and pointed. You'll regret making this so difficult. People will believe me, not you. Her words sliced not because they were new, but because they were familiar. Elias had sat in boardrooms where doubt always tilted toward the other side. He had walked into restaurants where service slowed mysteriously at his table. He had lived the truth of what she claimed, that the world often took her word over his. He closed his eyes briefly, drawing in strength from some inner reservoir. He reminded himself, truth has a way of surfacing, but only if someone refuses to move aside. When he opened them again, his expression was unreadable. Calm as still water, passengers began to murmur. A woman in 15C leaned forward and said quietly, "He showed his ticket. Why is this even an issue?" Margaret spun around, glaring. "Mind your own business." The atmosphere inside the cabin grew taut, like a string pulled too tight. Boarding slowed to a trickle. The hum of chatter was replaced with a brittle silence. Elias sat motionless, but inside his chest the dialogue raged. "If I move, I'll keep peace but lose myself. If I stay, I risk being painted as a problem. Either way, I'm judged before I speak." For the first time, his hand clenched slightly against his knee. It was a tiny crack in the calm, quickly concealed, but it was real. Margaret shifted her tote from one arm to the other, still blocking the aisle. Her voice rose again. "This is holding everyone up. Why should one man make the rest of us wait?" The irony of her statement hung unacknowledged, though a few passengers exchanged glances. They knew who was really holding things up. At that moment, another flight attendant entered the scene. She was younger, with auburn hair pulled back neatly, name tag reading Rachel Morgan. Her expression was careful, but her tone firm. "What's going on here?" Margaret gestured dramatically toward Elias. "This man refuses to move. I've asked him nicely. He's being difficult." Rachel's eyes moved to Elias, then to his boarding pass still visible in his hand. She leaned closer, scanning. 14A. She read quietly. "That matches your ticket." She straightened, her gaze steady on Margaret. "Ma'am, he's in the correct seat." Margaret's mouth opened, then snapped shut. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Rachel continued, calm but unwavering. "If there's a mix-up, we can check your boarding pass, but this passenger is not at fault." The nearby passengers shifted in their seats, relief almost palpable that someone from the crew acknowledged what they could all see. Elias felt a wave of gratitude, though he kept it contained. He nodded once at Rachel, a silent, "Thank you." Margaret bristled. "I don't need to be lectured by you. I asked for a simple courtesy. Now everyone is against me." But the tide in the cabin was already turning. A few murmurs of agreement with Rachel rippled through the rows. The man in 13C muttered, "About time someone said it." Rachel didn't back down. "Please, ma'am, find your assigned seat so we can continue boarding." Margaret shot one last glare at Elias, her voice dropping to a hiss. "This isn't over." Then she turned sharply, heels clicking against the narrow aisle as she stomped toward the back. For the first time since the confrontation began, Elias allowed himself to exhale fully. The cabin's tension eased just slightly, but as he glanced toward the front of the plane, he saw Tom Bradley returning, his jaw set, clipboard tucked under his arm. His eyes flickered from Elias to Rachel, and something in that look carried the promise that the matter was far from settled. Elias adjusted his jacket, folded his boarding pass carefully, and leaned back against the seat. He knew instinctively this was only the beginning. Tom Bradley returned to row 14 with the authority of someone who expected his words to settle the matter. His clipboard was tucked under his arm now, and his jaw tightened as he looked first at Elias Carter, then at Rachel Morgan. The two flight attendants stood on opposite ends of the same aisle, and passengers sensed the fault line dividing them. Tom's voice was clipped, businesslike. "Mr. Carter, the situation is not resolved. You've created a delay, and if you continue, we'll have to classify this as noncompliance." Elias kept his eyes calm, his tone steady. "I'm seated according to my boarding pass. I haven't created anything except a decision to remain in the place I purchased. Rachel shifted slightly closer, as though bracing for the blowback. She spoke carefully. Tom, he's in the correct seat. I checked myself. The conflict came from a misunderstanding. Tom shot her a look sharp enough to cut glass. We can discuss that later. For now, we need to move forward. He turned back to Elias. Sir, if you don't cooperate, I'll have to escalate. A few passengers whispered, phones angled discreetly toward the scene. In row 15, Maya Lopez raised her phone higher. She didn't speak, but the red recording light blinked steadily, catching the tension as it thickened. Margaret Hill had not retreated far. She lingered 2 rows back, arms crossed, eyes glinting with satisfaction as Tom placed the weight of the issue on Elias. Her voice carried forward like a sharp needle. See, he's the one making trouble. The words pierced more than Elias wanted to admit. Inside, a battle surged one side, whispering that he could end this by standing up, moving back, letting her take the seat. The other side, the one rooted deep in years of compromise and quiet surrender, rose stronger. Why is my dignity always negotiable, he thought. Why is peace always my responsibility, while others get to demand without consequence? His daughter's voice echoed again in memory. Daddy, why do you always say sorry even when it's not your fault? He unclenched his fist slowly, placed it on his lap, and spoke in a tone even softer than before, but more resolute. I will not move. The cabin felt it, the weight of those 4 words. A declaration, not loud, but immovable. Tom scribbled quickly on his clipboard, muttering something under his breath. Then he tapped his radio. I'm filing an incident report. Aggressive passenger, row 14A. The word aggressive hung heavy. Elias didn't raise his voice, didn't move an inch beyond calm posture. Yet the label slid onto the paper like a stain he couldn't wash off. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, knowing that silence itself was sometimes the sharpest protest. Rachel's eyes widened. Tom, that's not accurate, she whispered. But Tom ignored her, already stepping toward the front. Margaret smiled faintly, then forced a cough that turned into a theatrical sniffle. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, sighing loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. I feel unsafe, she murmured. The irony stung Elias harder than her words. He, the one seated quietly with hands visible, was painted as danger, while the one making demands wrapped herself in victimhood. A man in row 13 leaned forward, whispering to Margaret, Ma'am, maybe just sit in your assigned seat. It's not worth it. Margaret snapped back, her voice sharp. You don't understand. I was promised better. I can't sit all the way in the back. Elias closed his eyes briefly, letting the murmurs wash over him. He knew what was happening. He had lived this pattern in boardrooms, in restaurants, in conferences. A scene built not on truth, but on assumption. A narrative shaping itself around him without his permission. His phone buzzed faintly in his pocket. He pulled it out under the tray table, glancing down. A message from his assistant and legal counsel. Chloe Anderson. How's the flight? Want me to confirm your arrival details? His thumb hesitated. For a moment, he debated. Should I involve her? Am I overreacting? Will this pass if I just endure? But the word aggressive burned in his mind. The thought of Chloe reading his name in a report that twisted calm into threat made his decision. He typed quickly. There's a situation. Need you ready in case it escalates? The reply came almost instantly. Got it. Keep me updated. I'm here. Elias slid the phone back into his pocket just as Rachel leaned closer. Her whisper was urgent. "Don't let them intimidate you. I saw what happened. You've done nothing wrong." Her words carried warmth, a thread of solidarity in a cold storm. Elias met her eyes and nodded slightly. It was enough to remind him he wasn't completely alone. At that moment, Margaret raised her voice again, performing for the cabin. "I can't believe I'm being forced to sit near someone who threatens me." Several passengers frowned openly now, but many stayed silent, the weight of discomfort pinning them in place. Elias felt the silence press on him harder than her accusations. The silence said, "We see, but we won't risk speaking." His inner voice wrestled louder than before. "If I resist, I may be dragged off this plane. If I comply, I betray myself. Either way, I lose something essential." He exhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, and leaned back in his seat. His choice was made. Tom returned. Radio clipped back to his belt, his clipboard filled with notes. His words were final. "Captain Wallace has been informed. We'll deal with this before departure." The announcement hung heavy. Every passenger now understood this was no longer a seat dispute. It was an incident, an official matter. Elias felt the plane itself hold its breath. The hum of the engines had not yet begun, but the cabin carried its own vibration, the low rustle of unease that spread row by row. Elias Carter sat upright in 14A, his hands still resting calmly on his lap, though inside his thoughts swirled like a storm beneath a still lake. Margaret Hill's performance lingered in the air, her trembling voice claiming she felt unsafe, her tissue dabbing away imaginary tears. Tom Bradley's clipboard had turned those accusations into official ink, and Elias knew the weight of a false word once it became a record. Passengers shifted in their seats, some watching openly now, others glancing quickly, then turning away. The silence pressed harder than the accusations. Silence meant consent, or at least complicity, and Elias felt the sting of it as keenly as Margaret's words. Then came a voice, low but steady, from the row across the aisle. "Excuse me," said a man in a gray blazer with lines etched deep around his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, addressing Rachel Morgan, who still lingered near row 14. "I saw what happened." He showed his boarding pass. "He's in the right seat." Rachel turned, relief flickering across her features. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. The man introduced himself with a nod. "Daniel Price. I think it's wrong how this is being handled." Elias glanced at him, their eyes meeting briefly. There was no need for words. A nod was enough a recognition of allyship in a cabin filled with silence. But the silence still outweighed the voices. A woman 2 rows back pulled her cardigan tighter and stared down at her lap. A teenager across the aisle, earbuds dangling, whispered, "That's messed up," but didn't raise her voice. The bystander effect held its grip. Most people wanted peace, even if peace came at the cost of truth. Margaret, sensing the shift, raised her chin defiantly. "So now strangers are taking his side. Unbelievable. I've flown with this airline for decades. Never once have I been treated like this." Her voice quivered at the edges, the practiced tremor of someone who knew the power of performance. Elias resisted the urge to answer. He had nothing to prove to her. But inside, a new struggle began. Do I let Rachel and this man carry part of the weight, or is silence still my burden to bear? He remembered board meetings where allies had stayed quiet until too late, until his reputation had already been framed by someone else's narrative. He had learned the cost of misplaced trust, and yet He also knew change never came from one voice alone. Rachel spoke firmly now, no longer whispering. Mr. Carter is in the correct seat. He has not raised his voice. He has not threatened anyone. This needs to be acknowledged before things escalate further. Margaret rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, please. You're siding with him because you feel sorry for him. That's not fairness. That's bias. The hypocrisy of the statement hung heavy. Several passengers exchanged looks. One even let out a short, incredulous laugh before stifling it quickly. Daniel Price leaned forward further, his tone sharper now. Bias, ma'am. The only bias here is yours. The word struck like a small crack in the dam. A murmur spread through the nearby rows, subtle but growing. The narrative Margaret tried to spin began to fray at the edges. But Tom Bradley returned before it could unravel further. His face was set, his voice clipped with finality. Captain Wallace is aware. This will be addressed before departure. Everyone, please remain calm. Rachel turned toward him, her tone sharper than before. Tom, you wrote an inaccurate report. That's not calm. That's escalation. Tom's eyes hardened. I'm doing my job. We'll resolve this properly. Elias remained silent, his gaze steady on the back of the seat ahead. He had spoken enough. Every word risked being twisted. Now he listened, letting the voices around him reveal where truth lived and where it faltered. Margaret, sensing Tom's presence as support, resumed her posture of the aggrieved. I can't sit here. I won't sit here. Not when I feel threatened. Daniel's jaw tightened. He muttered under his breath, threatened by what a man sitting quietly, but his words were swallowed by the cabin's tension. The silence from the majority still hurt. Elias felt it like a weight pressing down. He understood it, fear of involvement, fear of delay, fear of attention, but it did not make it less bitter. Inside, his thoughts wrestled. Maybe they're right. Maybe silence is safer. Maybe I should have moved. But what lesson does that teach? That dignity is negotiable, that my comfort is expendable, so hers can be protected. And what about the next man asked to move? And the one after that? He thought of his daughter again. The way her small face had scrunched in confusion when she'd asked why he apologized so often. He thought of the promise he had made silently that day. One day, I'll show you what it means to stand your ground. His decision remained the same. He would not move. Rachel's voice carried louder now, no longer confined to their row. This is wrong. Everyone here knows it. A passenger is being treated unfairly. And if we let this slide, what does it say about all of us? Her words struck chords and scattered hearts. The young teenager whispered, She's right. The woman in the cardigan lifted her eyes briefly, though she still said nothing. Margaret sneered. So now you're making speeches. This isn't a courtroom. It's a plane. But Elias knew it was always a courtroom, invisible but real. Every moment of prejudice was a trial of dignity, and the jury was everyone watching, deciding silently what mattered and what didn't. He inhaled deeply, the recycled air dry in his throat, and steadied himself. His silence now was no longer retreat. It was defiance. Every second he stayed seated was testimony louder than words. Passengers shifted again, tension filling the spaces between them. Some would later admit they wished they had spoken sooner. For now, they sat in the uneasy balance between fear and conscience, and Elias remained in 14A, the calm center of a storm he hadn't chosen, but would not abandon. The intercom crackled above the rows, and Captain Wallace's voice filled the cabin, calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, We are experiencing a brief delay. Please remain in your seats until we resolve an issue with the passenger manifest. The wording was vague, deliberate. Most people sighed, already pulling out their phones or flipping through in-flight magazines. But those in rows near 14 knew what the issue really was. Tom Bradley stood tall, clipboard pressed to his chest, glancing at Elias as though he had already passed judgment. Margaret Hill sat rigid in 14B, her expression painted with righteous indignation. Every so often she dabbed her eyes with her tissue, making sure nearby passengers could see her discomfort. Elias Carter remained still, his eyes fixed forward, though inside, his thoughts churned like restless waves against an unseen shore. Rachel Morgan broke the silence. "Captain, with respect, we don't need further delay. The passenger is in his rightful seat. I confirmed it myself." Tom shot her a glare sharp enough to cut steel. "Rachel, we'll discuss this later. You're out of line." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. What's out of line is fabricating reports. Several passengers leaned closer, straining to hear. The murmur of curiosity began to ripple again, pulling attention back toward row 14. Margaret seized the moment. "Do you hear this? Even your crew is divided. No wonder I feel unsafe. This man hasn't even apologized. He just sits there, smug." Elias finally turned his head toward her, his voice even, but quiet. "I am not smug. I am tired. Tired of being told my comfort is optional, my presence negotiable. I paid for this seat, and I will not move." The calmness in his tone contrasted so sharply with Margaret's theatrics that for a moment the balance in the cabin shifted. Daniel Price, the man in the gray blazer, leaned into the aisle. "He shouldn't have to move." "We all saw it," Tom snapped. "Sir, please remain seated. We'll handle this." Elias glanced at Tom, his mind running through calculations the way he often did in boardrooms. "If they remove me now, it will be under the label of non-compliant. That word will follow me into reports, headlines, judgments. But if I sit silent, I am erased." Then he thought of his daughter again, her small hand tugging at his sleeve when she'd asked, "Daddy, why do you always say sorry?" He had swallowed his answer then. Now it came back, clear and resolute, because too often the world demands it, but not this time. The cabin grew hotter, though the air system hummed steadily. Pressure built invisibly, like steam pushing against metal. Maya Lopez, the young woman with the phone, raised it higher. She had been silent so far, but her recording had caught every word. She whispered to the man beside her, "People need to see this." Margaret noticed the phone and snapped, "Put that away. You can't record me without permission." Maya didn't flinch, then maybe stop acting like no one's watching. Gas traveled through the row. A few clapped lightly, the sound quickly stifled, but still enough to shift the air. Margaret's face flushed crimson. Captain Wallace emerged from the cockpit then, his tall frame filling the aisle. He surveyed the scene, eyes narrowing. "What's happening here?" Tom stepped forward eagerly. "Captain, as I reported, the passenger in 14A is causing disturbance and making another passenger feel unsafe." "I recommend removal before takeoff," Rachel interjected swiftly. "That's not accurate. He has remained calm. The disturbance stems from a seat dispute instigated by Mos Hill." The captain's gaze moved from Tom to Rachel to Elias. "Mr. Carter, is that correct?" Elias inhaled slowly, then answered, "I am in my assigned seat. I have not raised my voice, threatened, or disobeyed instructions. The request to move came only because another passenger preferred my seat. Margaret clutched her chest dramatically. Preferred I was terrified. He glared at me. Daniel cut her off. That's not true. He sat silent the whole time. We all saw it. A rumble of agreement spread among a few rows. The tide was shifting, subtle but real. But Captain Wallace's expression remained unreadable. Regardless of perspective, my job is safety. If any passenger feels unsafe, we have to respond. Elias's voice deepened, not with anger, but with gravity. And what about when a passenger is unsafe because of false accusations? Who protects me? Who protects the truth? The words lingered in the cabin like smoke, impossible to ignore. Passengers exchanged uneasy looks. Some lowered their eyes, unwilling to face the truth within his question. Others nodded slightly, guilt flickering in their faces. Tom pressed again. Captain, we cannot debate this endlessly. Policy allows removal under crew discretion. We should act. Rachel squared her shoulders. Policy also requires accuracy in reporting, and if you remove him unjustly, that will be on record too. The standoff crackled with tension. Elias sat still, but his pulse beat like a drum in his ears. Inside, his mind battled. If I resist, they'll say I'm aggressive. If I comply, they'll say I admit guilt. Either way, I lose, unless I bring light where they hope for shadow. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket. The cabin stiffened, breath caught, but what emerged was not a weapon. It was his phone. He unlocked it with calm precision, pressed a single contact, and lifted it to his ear. Leah, he said softly, his voice steady. It's time. On the other end. Leah Okoro, his head of global security at Carter Dynamics, answered with quiet authority. Understood. Protocols live. The passengers didn't understand, but the crew stiffened, sensing the weight behind his words. Margaret scoffed loudly. What? Calling your lawyer already? How pathetic. But within minutes, the cabin Wi-Fi pinged alive with alerts. Screens lit up across rows as notifications rolled in. Breaking passenger mistreated aboard Flight 2287 live footage emerging. Maya's video had synced directly to a secure channel. Leah's team amplified it instantly. The story was already leaving the plane before it left the ground. The balance shifted. Now, silence would not bury truth. The world was watching, and everyone aboard felt the tremor of that realization. The cabin buzzed with uneasy energy, the kind that hummed through skin and made every whisper sound louder than it was. Passengers who had been half asleep minutes earlier now leaned toward the aisle, eyes darting between Elias Carter, still rooted in 14A, and the crew who stood over him. The faint blue glow of phones lit faces across rows, each person aware that this was no longer just a private altercation. It was a story unfolding in real time. Elias held the phone to his ear, his voice steady as he spoke into it again. Leah, confirm the stream is secure? Yes, Leah Okoro's calm voice replied on speaker. We've locked the feed, verified uploads, and distributed to our monitoring partners. Anything that happens here is being archived in multiple jurisdictions. You are not alone. The cabin stirred at those words. Some passengers exchanged startled looks. Margaret Hill scoffed, her tissue still crumpled in her fist. This is ridiculous. You're turning a simple misunderstanding into a circus. Rachel Morgan folded her arms tightly, her voice carrying a quiet conviction. It stopped being simple the moment lies were written into her report. Tom Bradley's jaw flexed. This is unauthorized. Captain, We cannot let a passenger weaponize technology against the crew. But Captain Wallace did not answer immediately. His eyes scanned the cabin, lingering on the phones, on the recording light in Maya Lopez's hand, on Daniel Price's defiant posture. He could feel the mood turning, the control slipping from his grasp. Elias lowered the phone slightly, addressing no one and everyone at once. If truth is a weapon, then let it cut through silence. The sentence hung heavy, almost lyrical, as though the air itself wanted to hold it a moment longer. Even those who had avoided eye contact now looked up, drawn by the gravity of his tone. Margaret broke the spell with a shrill edge. Are we really going to let him grandstand, Captain? Remove him. Right now. But before the captain could answer, the ding of incoming notifications rippled through the rows. Passengers blinked at their screens. Breaking live feed from Flight 2287 exposes racial bias incident. Trending now. The hashtag #DingerSeatInjustice began crawling across timelines. Maya's video had gone viral in minutes. Rachel inhaled sharply. It's out there. Tom paled. He gripped his clipboard as if it could anchor him. This isn't how we do things. Procedures exist for a reason. Elias looked at him evenly. Procedures that silence the wronged aren't procedures. They're cages. The murmurs grew louder. Passengers whispering fiercely now. He's right. I knew this was wrong. They can't get away with it. The tide had turned, and the crew felt it pressing like a wave. Captain Wallace cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, if you continue this, I'll have to consult with ground control before departure. Elias met his gaze. Do what you must. But know this, by the time you finish your call, the world will already have finished theirs. Margaret's patience snapped. She lunged to stand, pointing at Elias. You think you're untouchable because of your phone calls, because of your little performance. You're nothing but. Her words cut short as Daniel Price stood abruptly, his voice sharp enough to command attention. Enough. Sit down. Ms. Hill, you've humiliated yourself enough for one flight. The cabin erupted in gasps. Margaret froze, her face reddening. But Daniel's stare did not waver. His voice lowered, still firm. We've all seen what happened. He owes you nothing. Not a seat. Not an apology. Not his dignity. Silence followed. Heavy, but different now, no longer complicit, but shifting, awakening. Maya's phone buzzed with another alert. She whispered to herself, It's everywhere now. She turned the screen to the woman beside her, showing streams of comments flooding in. Stay strong. Justice in real time. Fire the crew. The words that once felt private were now amplified by thousands. The cabin itself seemed smaller, compressed by the knowledge that they were no longer just passengers. They were witnesses, unwillingly drafted into history. Tom's face hardened, though his voice shook. Captain, this has to stop before it gets worse. But Elias leaned back in his seat, calm as ever. His silence was louder than Margaret's tantrums, more commanding than Tom's orders. His stillness was a mirror, forcing everyone to confront the storm around him. For the first time, Captain Wallace's authority cracked. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his collar. His eyes lingered on Elias, then on the sea of phones, then finally on Rachel. If I remove him now, he admitted quietly, this airline will never recover. Rachel nodded. And if you don't, maybe it finally learns what accountability looks like. The captain hesitated. A man caught between policy and conscience. But outside the aircraft, beyond the tarmac, momentum was already moving faster than any decision he could make. Back in headquarters, Leah Okoro monitored feeds lighting up across networks. Hashtags surged, news alerts rang out, and commentators demanded answers. She leaned toward her console, her words crisp as she relayed to Elias. Media outlets are requesting statements. I've held them back. But your position is clear. You have leverage now. Elias answered softly into his phone. Not leverage, proof. Passengers shifted again, no longer slumping in uneasy avoidance but leaning forward, engaged. For the first time, eyes that had been turned away met Elias's directly. Some nodded subtly. Some whispered apologies. One older woman in row 15 whispered loud enough for all near her to hear, "Stay in your seat. Son, don't you dare move." Elias closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the weight of those words. In them, he heard generations of voices, some silenced, some still fighting. It gave him strength, not the strength of anger, but of resolve, the kind that burns quiet but unyielding. Margaret, cornered by the shifting tide, muttered desperately, "This isn't fair. This isn't how things work." Elias opened his eyes, his voice low but clear. Maybe not before, but it is now. The cabin fell still again. This was no longer just about a seat on Flight 2287. It was about every time someone had been told to move, to shrink, to vanish quietly for someone else's comfort. It was about rewriting the silent rule that some people's dignity weighed less. For the first time, Elias allowed himself a small exhale of relief, not because the battle was over, but because it was no longer his alone. The sound of dozens of notifications filled the cabin like a strange chorus, dings and buzzes layering over one another until no one could ignore them. Passengers looked down at their glowing screens, scrolling furiously. A man in row 17 whispered in awe, "This thing's trending. Already? Look, Sarksh's seat in justice." Maya Lopez couldn't keep up with the flood of comments flashing across her live feed. She held her phone steady, but her lips parted as she read the words racing by. "Don't move. We've got your back. Expose them." Some viewers typed from airports across the country, others from offices, buses, homes, an invisible crowd now boarding Flight 2287 without ever stepping onto the plane. Rachel Morgan scanned the cabin and noticed something shift. People were no longer shrinking into their seats. Heads leaned toward the aisle, eyes fixed forward. Fear hadn't vanished, but it was giving way to something else. Awareness, maybe even courage. Margaret Hill, however, doubled down. She clutched her handbag tighter, raising her voice so the nearest rows could hear. "This is outrageous. A mob on the internet doesn't change the facts. I don't feel safe next to him. That's the end of it." Her words rang hollow now, bouncing off passengers who had seen too much. Daniel Price sat straighter, his voice firm. "You don't get to twist reality just because it suits you. We all saw what happened." Elias Carter hadn't moved from his seat, but his presence anchored the space. His phone still rested in his hand. Leah Okoro's voice occasionally cutting through the noise with updates. "National outlets are picking it up. Video views just crossed 500,000. Elias whispered in reply. "Keep documenting. No edits. No spin." Leah's voice returned. Steady. Understood. Pure truth only. Tom Bradley tried to regain control, clutching his clipboard like a lifeline. "Captain, we cannot allow outside interference to dictate protocol. If we let passengers live stream crew decisions, we lose authority." Rachel shot him a look that pierced. Authority isn't lost when it's questioned. It's lost when it abuses trust. Passengers murmured approval. One woman in row 12 clapped softly, before realizing how unusual that was on an idle tarmac. Still, she didn't stop. The sound echoed, sharp against the cabin's hum. Captain Wallace rubbed the bridge of his nose, torn between training and the spectacle unfolding around him. He had led flights through storms and mechanical failures, but never through a crisis where every second was being broadcast worldwide. He felt sweat bead under his cap. "This can't continue," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. But Elias heard him. His reply was calm, not confrontational. "It already has. The question is whether you'll stand with the truth or against it." The captain froze, the weight of decision pressing down. He glanced toward the cockpit door, as though escape lay just a few feet away, then back at the passengers whose phones were now pointed like silent witnesses. Maya caught his hesitation on camera. She whispered to the stream, "He doesn't know what to do. He's stuck." Thousands of comments exploded in agreement. Margaret's tone turned shrill. "This is harassment. I'm the victim here. I'm being filmed without consent." But her protests fell flat against the steady feed of her actions replaying online. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were part of a story bigger than themselves. Others leaned into it, whispering audibly, "She's lying." He's calm. "It's all on record." Elias allowed himself one long breath. His mind flickered back to memories of boardrooms where power sat behind polished mahogany tables. He had survived men who smiled as they dismissed his proposals, colleagues who praised diversity while undermining his every move. He knew this pattern well. Yet here, the setting was a narrow aluminum tube at 35 rows long, and the stakes were no less profound. For a fleeting second, doubt returned. Am I pushing too far? Will this backfire? Will they twist it? Say I endangered the flight. His thumb hovered near the edge of his phone, as if ready to cut the stream. But then he remembered his daughter's eyes, that look of confusion mixed with hurt when she had asked why he always apologized. He had promised himself she would one day see a different answer. That promise kept his hand steady. Rachel stepped closer, her voice carrying over the low hum. "Captain, passengers deserve dignity as much as safety. If this airline stands for both, we can't punish Mr. Carter for someone else's prejudice." The cabin erupted with soft murmurs of agreement. Some passengers clapped again, louder this time. Even those who had been silent now tilted their heads toward Elias, as if acknowledging what they had known all along. Tom hissed through clenched teeth, "You're making a spectacle." Rachel didn't flinch. "No, you made a spectacle when you wrote lies on that report." Captain Wallace's composure cracked visibly. His voice wavered when he finally spoke. I'll need to confer with operations." But before he could retreat, Leah's voice carried from Elias's phone, amplified by the speaker. "Operations has already been informed. Media, regulators, and corporate leadership are aware. Every word, every decision is documented. The world is watching." The cabin fell into stunned silence. It was no longer an argument between a passenger and crew. It had become evidence in a public trial. Elias closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. His internal struggle wasn't gone. Fear still gnawed. Doubt still whispered, but his resolve burned brighter. He would not move. Not today. Not for comfort. Not for convenience. Daniel broke the silence with a sharp exhale. "Captain, with respect, if you remove him now, you'll be remembered as the man who kicked a paying customer off his rightful seat on camera. That's not safety. That's career suicide." A ripple of gasps followed his bluntness, but he wasn't wrong. Everyone knew it. Margaret shook her head in disbelief, her voice rising one last desperate time. "You'll all regret this. You're siding against me. You're making a terrible mistake." But even as she spoke, the notifications buzzed again, headlines rolling out faster than her words could reach. Passenger targeted over seat dispute. Live footage reveals bias at 30,000 feet. Airline faces crisis as video spreads worldwide. Maya turned her screen toward Margaret, her voice calm but edged. "The mistake is thinking no one would notice." Margaret froze, her mouth still open, but no words escaping. For the first time, she seemed smaller, deflated under the weight of exposure. Elias remained silent, his presence commanding more than any speech could. The storm had crested, and though the turbulence was far from over, he felt the tide shifting beneath him. For the first time since the ordeal began, he allowed himself a single thought of victory, not for himself alone, but for the principle now too visible to erase. The cabin's air seemed heavier than before, as though the oxygen itself had thickened under the pressure of too many eyes, too many truths exposed. Every cough, every shuffle of shoes against the carpet rang louder in the silence that followed Margaret Hill's last outburst. Passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were choosing sides. And for the first time since the ordeal began, it was clear which side was growing stronger. Elias Carter sat motionless, still anchored in 14A, though inside his pulse thundered in his ears. His phone rested against his thigh. Leah Okoro's calm updates still threading into his consciousness like a lifeline. "Elias," she said evenly, "you're trending #1. 3 networks have broken into programming. Corporate headquarters is aware. Executives are dialing in." He closed his eyes for the briefest moment, inhaling deeply. "This isn't just about me anymore. It never was. It's about every time silence swallowed truth." Captain Wallace lingered in the aisle, his hand brushing against the overhead compartment for balance, though the plane hadn't moved an inch. Sweat collected near his collar as his mind wrestled with the weight of decisions that could no longer be hidden in crew reports. His voice, when it came, sounded brittle. "Mr. Carter, if I allow this live stream to continue, I compromise the authority of this flight." Elias opened his eyes slowly, meeting the captain's gaze. His voice was steady, resonant. "Authority isn't compromised by transparency. It's proven by it." That line seemed to ripple through the rows like a spark. Someone muttered, "That's true." A man further back whispered, "He's right." The tide of whispers swelled again. Tom Bradley gripped his clipboard harder, the veins in his forearm tightening. "Captain, we can't let a passenger dictate operations. If we allow this Rachel Morgan cut in sharply, if we allow this, then maybe we finally stop allowing lies to go unchecked." Her voice didn't tremble. If anything, it rang clearer than ever. Margaret hissed, "This is madness. He's manipulating all of you. He's dangerous." Daniel Price leaned halfway into the aisle, his voice louder than before, cutting through her accusation. "No, Ms. Hill. Dangerous is when lies become law." Passengers shifted, nodding, whispering. A few even clapped again, hesitant but audible. The cabin wasn't united, but the silence that once sheltered injustice was cracking apart. Then it happened, the first real fracture of authority. A young flight attendant, no older than 25, slipped quietly from the back galley. She walked slowly, almost timidly, then stopped near Elias's row. Her voice shook, but her words carried. "I saw what happened too. He did nothing wrong." The cabin froze. Tom's head snapped toward her, fury flashing in his eyes. "Anna, not now!" But the attendant Anna held her ground, even as her hands trembled at her sides. "If I stay silent, I'm complicit. I won't be complicit." Rachel's chest rose, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said softly. Elias turned his head slightly toward Anna. His eyes warm, though his face remained controlled. "Your courage matters," he said. "Just loud enough for those nearby to hear." Margaret sputtered, her confidence unraveling further. "What is this? A mutiny against a paying passenger like me." Maya Lopez finally spoke, her voice breaking the rhythm of typing as she addressed the stream and the cabin at once. "Against lies. Ms. Hill. Not against you, against lies." The live stream chat exploded. "Respect to Anna. Heroes on board. Accountability is happening." Captain Wallace rubbed his temple, feeling control slipping like sand through his fingers. "Enough. We need resolution before this escalates further." Elias leaned back slightly, his voice calm but deliberate. "Resolution isn't removing me. Resolution is recognizing the truth. Anything less will follow this airline forever." At that moment, Leah's voice pierced through his phone again. "Update headquarters emergency board meeting just started. Video footage is playing inside. Executives are demanding names." Rachel looked at Tom sharply, her words quiet but searing. "You hear that names, reports. This won't be buried." Tom's face drained of color. His grip on the clipboard loosened. For the first time, his authority faltered not from outside pressure, but from within himself. Margaret tried once more, desperation raw in her tone. "Captain, please, I cannot sit next to him. He's hostile." But her words were drowned out by a sound no one expected. It wasn't shouts or applause. It was humming, low at first, almost tentative. An older woman in row 15, the same one who had whispered encouragement earlier, began humming softly a tune, familiar to some, foreign to others. It grew, trembling but steady. It was "We Shall Overcome." Her neighbor joined in, then another, until pockets of the cabin carried the melody. Not loud, not rehearsed, but undeniable. A current of solidarity filled the narrow space. Elias felt his throat tighten, not from fear this time, but from something deeper. He turned slightly toward the sound, eyes stinging. He hadn't expected this, not here, not now. Margaret looked around wildly, her voice shrill. "What are you doing? Stop this. This is insane." But the song carried on, soft but unstoppable. Even those who didn't know the words hummed along, adding to the harmony that drowned her protests. Elias' voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "This is bigger than me." Rachel placed a steady hand on the back of his seat. "Yes, and it always was." Captain Wallace's face sagged, as though he realized the fight was already lost. He turned toward the cockpit, his voice weary. "Get me operations, now." The song faded, replaced by silence once more. But it was no longer the silence of complicity. It was the silence of people waiting, holding their breath for the verdict that would define not just this flight, but something much larger. Elias sat still, his hands calm in his lap, the phone resting against his thigh again. Inside, the storm of doubt and fear quieted slightly. He had not chosen this stage, but now he carried it, not for himself alone, but for everyone who had ever been told to move, to disappear, to make way for comfort that wasn't theirs. Leah's voice came again, crisp and unwavering. "They've seen enough. Decisions are being made." And in that moment, everyone aboard knew the breaking point had been reached. There was no turning back. The stillness after the humming ended lingered like a held breath. Everyone aboard knew the atmosphere had changed. The balance of power no longer belonged entirely to the crew. Authority was now scattered, flowing between Elias Carter's calm presence, the courage of witnesses like Rachel Morgan and Anna, and the invisible millions watching through Maya Lopez's stream. Elias sat back, his posture steady, his gaze directed forward, but seeing more than the confines of 14A. Leah Okoro's voice came again through the speaker, this time carrying an edge that demanded attention. Elias, confirm you can hear me. The board meeting is in session. I'm patched into live audio. Elias tilted the phone closer, and passengers nearby caught fragments of voices executives speaking in clipped tones, their words strained with panic. Crisis protocol. Trending globally. We cannot allow removal. Immediate accountability required. The realization spread like fire through the rows. The airline's leadership was not just aware. They were scrambling in real time. Margaret Hill stiffened, her voice rising with frantic urgency. You can't let a mob of online strangers dictate what happens here. I'm the one in danger, not him, Daniel Price. Unflinching, replied. The only danger here is what your lies would have done, if not exposed. Margaret's cheeks burned crimson, her protest ringing weaker each time. For the first time, her voice trembled not with performance, but with fear. Tom Bradley tried to steady himself, his authority hanging by a thread. Captain, we have to maintain order. If corporate interferes with our discretion. But Captain Wallace cut him off sharply, his composure cracking. Order, you've created chaos. Tom, you filed a false report, and now the entire world is watching us unravel. His voice dropped lower, but the frustration in it carried clearly. Do you understand what you've done? Rachel's eyes narrowed, her tone fierce. He understood the moment he chose to write lies instead of truth. The captain exhaled heavily, as though years of ingrained loyalty to crew hierarchy were colliding with a new and undeniable reality. He glanced at Elias, his words reluctant but honest. Mr. Carter, it seems your call has changed the landscape. Headquarters will be issuing instructions momentarily. Leah's voice came through again, sharper now, more direct. Instruction confirmed. Immediate removal of implicated crew from active duty. Suspension effective as of this moment. Captain Wallace, you are to cooperate fully. The announcement stunned the cabin. Passengers gasped. Some whispered in disbelief. Rachel's shoulders sagged in relief, while Anna covered her mouth with trembling hands. Tom staggered a step back, his clipboard slipping from his grip and clattering to the floor. No, this can't. Leah's voice cut through his denial. Bradley, your badge access is revoked. Security will escort you upon landing. Do not engage further. The young live streamer Maya caught every second, the comments surging faster than she could read them. Fired live. Justice served. This is history. Margaret's voice pitched higher. Desperate. What about me? What about my safety? Are you all blind? But even Captain Wallace turned cold eyes on her. Ms. Hill, your behavior has endangered this entire flight's integrity. You'll be deplaned as soon as we return to the gate. Her face crumpled. Deplaned? You can't. Rachel spoke quietly, her tone cutting. Actions have consequences, even for you. Elias sat still, his pulse steady for the first time since the ordeal began. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lashed out, yet the truth had risen around him, carried by allies, amplified by strangers, crystallized by technology. Inside, though. He felt the weight of it all pressing against his chest. His mind whispered doubts. What if it hadn't gone this way? What if the silence had held? Would I be sitting in a cell instead of 14A? He let the thoughts pass like shadows, but didn't ignore them. They reminded him of how fragile justice could be, how easily it could tilt the other direction. Leah's voice returned, steady as ever. Elias, you should know the CEO himself has been briefed. He's watching the feed. There will be a statement before the flight resumes. Passengers leaned toward one another, murmuring. The gravity of the situation was undeniable now. This wasn't just about one man and one seat. It was a referendum on how dignity could no longer be negotiable. Margaret slumped back into her seat, her defiance draining as whispers of disapproval surrounded her. Some passengers shook their heads openly at her. Others refused to meet her eyes, as though ashamed to have once sat silent while she hurled her accusations. Tom stood rigid, face pale, sweat beading along his temple. He looked less like authority and more like a man who had gambled everything on a lie and lost in front of the world. Captain Wallace's radio crackled. He pressed it to his ear, his expression grim. "Copy," he muttered, then faced the cabin. "Headquarters has confirmed. Certain members of this crew are relieved of duty effective immediately. We'll be returning to the gate." A ripple of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger. Passengers clapped, some cheering softly, others simply nodding in grim satisfaction. Rachel's eyes glistened, though her voice remained steady. "It's the right call." Elias remained seated, unmoved by the applause. Gratitude stirred within him, but so did something heavier, a knowledge that this was just one battle won in a war far larger than one flight. Still, a quiet strength settled in his chest. For once, truth had not been buried. He lifted the phone closer to his lips. "Leah, thank you." Her reply was simple, almost tender. "You did what you always do. You held the line." For the first time that night, Elias allowed himself to close his eyes and exhale without the weight of bracing for the next blow. The return to the gate was a quiet descent from tension, like an orchestra playing its final notes after a storm of sound. The cabin lights glowed softly as the jet taxied, but the silence among the passengers said more than any announcement could. People were processing, replaying what they had just witnessed. Some whispered, others stared straight ahead. Many stole glances at Elias Carter, who remained seated, hands folded calmly in his lap, eyes fixed on the seat back in front of him. Margaret Hill muttered angrily under her breath, her words now lacking the volume and venom that had once filled them. She was a figure diminished, her posture defensive, shoulders hunched inward as though the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressed upon her. Even she seemed to sense that her performance had lost its stage. Tom Bradley, the disgraced flight attendant, stood rigid in the aisle, his face pale and drawn. The authority he had worn so easily an hour earlier had drained away. His eyes darted nervously, as though searching for one last lifeline. But none remained. The murmurs of passengers carried judgment, not sympathy. He looked like a man already half forgotten, a cautionary tale before the plane had even stopped moving. Rachel Morgan adjusted her scarf, her expression solemn. She had spoken up, and it had cost her something. Her voice had trembled, her courage tested, but she had held her ground. Elias glanced at her briefly, offering the smallest nod of acknowledgement, a gesture of respect that said what words didn't need to. "I saw you." "You mattered." Captain Wallace's voice came over the intercom, steady but heavy. "Ladies and gentlemen, We are returning to the gate as instructed by headquarters. Certain crew members will be leaving the aircraft before we resume operations. We appreciate your cooperation. A few passengers clapped again, but most remained silent, their eyes trained on the unfolding human drama. The plane eased into position, the jet bridge sliding into place with a low groan. The door opened, and 2 uniformed ground staff stepped aboard, followed by a security officer. Their presence was calm, professional, and absolute. "Mr. Bradley," one of the staff members said quietly, "please gather your things. You'll be escorted off." Tom's lips parted as if to protest, but the words died in his throat. He bent, picked up his fallen clipboard, and clutched it to his chest like a shield that could no longer protect him. His walk down the aisle was a gauntlet, passengers' eyes following him, some shaking their heads, others capturing the moment on their phones. Tom had once wielded authority over them, but now he exited under the gaze of their silent judgment. Margaret's turn came next. "Ms. Hill," the security officer said evenly, "you'll need to deplane." Her voice pitched up, brittle with indignation. "This is absurd. I paid for this seat, and I was the victim here. But no one moved to support her. No murmurs of agreement. No nods of solidarity. Instead, a few passengers actually chuckled softly, their disbelief at her audacity audible. Rachel folded her arms. Daniel Price shook his head slowly, and Maya Lopez's phone captured every second for her swelling audience online. Margaret tried again, pleading now. "You can't let him." She gestured wildly toward Elias. "Ruin my life like this." The security officer didn't waver. "Ma'am, please, now." With a final huff, Margaret gathered her oversized handbag, muttering curses under her breath. As she passed Elias, her glare was sharp, but her power had drained away. He didn't return the glare. Instead, he kept his eyes steady on the middle distance, refusing to let her bitterness pull him into another theater of humiliation. When the door closed behind her, the air inside the cabin shifted. A weight had lifted. For the first time since the ordeal began, passengers exchanged small smiles, a quiet current of relief flowing between strangers. Captain Wallace reappeared from the cockpit, his cap in hand. His usual air of authority was gone, replaced by something closer to humility. He stopped near Elias, lowering his voice so only the nearby rows could hear. "Mr. Carter, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I will file a report tonight that reflects exactly what happened. No excuses." Elias met his eyes. "That's all anyone should expect. The truth." The captain nodded, as though grateful for the simplicity of the reply. Then he turned back toward the cockpit, shoulders squared again, carrying the weight of leadership reshaped by accountability. Rachel slipped into the seat across the aisle, leaning slightly toward Elias. "They'll write about this, tonight, tomorrow, maybe for years." Elias's voice was low, but certain. "Let them. Stories shape what we tolerate and what we refuse to tolerate." Maya tilted her phone toward him, her live stream still rolling. "You just went viral in 30 countries. #justice at 30,000 feet. People are flooding the comments, saying this gives them hope." Elias gave her a faint, weary smile. "Hope is good, but I hope it's not just a #tomorrow." Rachel studied him carefully. "Why are you so calm after everything? I'd be shouting, screaming." He inhaled deeply, his gaze drifting toward the window where the tarmac lights glowed. "Because I've learned that shouting rarely changes the people who need changing. Calm, steady truth, that unsettles them more." Silence followed, heavy with respect. Passengers around them listened without pretending not to. They understood that they were witnesses not just to an incident, but to a lesson that touched something deeper. As the plane prepared to resume boarding replacements for the removed crew, Elias leaned back once more. His mind, however, refused rest. Thoughts circled like restless birds. What if no one had spoken? What if Rachel had stayed silent? If Maya hadn't recorded? If Leah hadn't answered? How many others sat alone in silence while the world turned away? The weight of those unseen stories pressed against him, but instead of crushing, it carved something within him. Resolve. When the intercom chimed again, it wasn't Captain Wallace's voice. It was corporate, a woman's voice, clear and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Helen Voss, Chief Operating Officer of Atlantic Horizon. On behalf of the company, I want to extend an apology to Mr. Elias Carter and to every passenger who witnessed what never should have happened. We are committed to ensuring accountability and change. The crew involved has been removed from duty, effective immediately. This flight will continue, but so will our responsibility. Thank you." Gasps followed, then applause louder this time, fuller, carrying relief and affirmation. Elias closed his eyes briefly, letting the moment wash over him. Not for the apology, words were cheap, but for the recognition that something had shifted. When he opened them again, Rachel was smiling faintly. "One call," she whispered, shaking her head. "Just one call." Elias corrected her gently. "One call and a chorus of witnesses willing to hold the line." The plane settled again, but the atmosphere was forever changed. What had begun as an attempt to erase one man's dignity had ended with an airline rewriting its own rules. Live before the world. The aircraft finally lifted off again, engines roaring against the midnight sky. But inside, the mood was entirely different. It was not just a plane climbing altitude. It was a cabin of people quietly reckoning with what they had seen. Some scrolled through their phones, reading news alerts that had already begun to spread. Others whispered, their eyes darting toward Elias Carter, who remained composed, though exhaustion tugged faintly at the corners of his expression. Maya Lopez leaned over the aisle, lowering her voice. "You're everywhere. Elias, hashtags, headlines, even live news tickers. This isn't just trending, it's exploding." Rachel Morgan, still seated across from Elias, studied him carefully. "They'll come after you, too. Not just the airline. People who don't want this kind of truth out in the open." Elias gave a small, thoughtful smile. "They already have. My whole life, in different ways. But truth doesn't belong to me alone. Tonight proved that." The captain's voice broke in again over the intercom, but it was different this time, lighter, steadier. "We've reached cruising altitude. For those who remained, thank you for your patience. We know this wasn't the evening you planned, but perhaps it was the evening we all needed." Passengers exchanged surprised glances. No one expected humility from the man who earlier had seemed complicit in silence. Yet here it was, threaded into his voice. Elias exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting to the window. The stars scattered outside like tiny witnesses, ancient and unwavering. Inside his chest, conflicting emotions wove together relief, sorrow, a strange quiet pride, but also an ache, deep and persistent. How many others endure this in silence? How many never get their moment of reversal? Daniel Price, the attorney who had spoken up, leaned across from his row. "Mr. Carter, when this lands figuratively and literally, there'll be lawsuits, policy reviews, maybe congressional hearings. You realize what's about to unfold." Elias's reply was calm, deliberate, Yes. But what matters isn't just what happens to an airline. It's whether dignity becomes non-negotiable, not a perk, not a privilege, but a baseline. That's what we fight for. Rachel's voice softened, almost a whisper. You sound like someone who's been waiting for this moment your whole life. He turned to her, his eyes steady. In a way, I have, not because I wanted it, but because life kept bringing me to it. The hum of the engines filled the silence that followed, giving his words room to breathe. Passengers listened, some nodding, some blinking back unexpected tears. 2 hours later, as the plane prepared to descend, phones buzzed simultaneously across the cabin. Push notifications, breaking news banners, live stream highlights. The story had leapt from one aircraft to an entire nation. Atlantic Horizon flight crew fired mid-air after racial incident with CEO Elias Carter. Maya's phone pinged again. Another headline. Justice at 30,000 feet, how a single call toppled silence. Rachel read over her shoulder, shaking her head. It's surreal. We're not just passengers anymore. We're witnesses in history. Elias smiled faintly. History is just yesterday's pain retold until it changes tomorrow. The landing was smooth, uneventful, but the energy in the cabin was taut. Cameras waited at the gate. Security formed a cordon, but not hostile protective, almost reverent. As the door opened, the flash of bulbs and hum of voices surged like a tide. Passengers streamed out first, some shielding their eyes, others walking proudly, knowing they had played a role. Rachel walked beside Elias, Maya close behind, phone still recording. Daniel carried himself with quiet dignity, his presence a reminder that justice had advocates even in unexpected seats. When Elias finally stepped into the terminal, the crowd hushed for a beat, then erupted in applause. Not staged, not orchestrated, just raw, human recognition. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended, questions fired. Mr. Carter, will you sue? What message do you have for America tonight? Do you think the airline can recover? Elias raised a hand, not commanding, but steadying. The noise dimmed, replaced by expectant silence. His voice carried clearly, unhurried, resonant. I didn't ask for this stage. I asked for a seat I had already paid for. What happened tonight wasn't just about me. It was about how quickly dignity can be denied, and how powerful it is when people refuse to let that denial stand. The crew made choices. So did passengers. So did corporate leaders. Tonight proved that accountability is possible, but it should never take a crisis to remind us. Every traveler, every worker, every person deserves respect without condition. The crowd erupted again, flashes bursting, but Elias's expression remained calm. He wasn't feeding on applause. He was grounding the truth. Helen Voss, the COO, stepped forward, her expression composed but resolute. Mr. Carter's right. We failed him. We failed our passengers. Tonight is not the end of this story. It's the beginning of change. Policies will be rewritten, training rebuilt, accountability enforced. We will not allow dignity to be negotiable within Atlantic Horizon. Her statement drew more headlines instantly, but her tone suggested this wasn't damage control. It was a vow. Later, in the quiet of a black SUV pulling away from the airport, Elias leaned back against the leather seat, fatigue washing over him. Leah Okoro sat beside him, her voice steady. You turned one of the worst nights of your life into a mirror for the whole country. How does that feel? Elias closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, his voice low. It feels like both a burden and a gift. The burden is that I know this will follow me, maybe forever. The gift is that maybe someone else won't have to live it. Leah studied him for a moment, then nodded. That's why you're who you are. Outside. The city lights stretched endlessly, like constellations mapped across concrete and glass. Inside, Elias carried both the scars of the night and the spark of something greater. The story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been asked to move, to shrink, to disappear. And it belonged to those who had finally chosen to say no. The SUV glided quietly through the night, Seattle's skyline glowing against the water. Elias Carter pressed his palm lightly against the glass, watching the blurred lights streak past. Exhaustion tugged at him, but sleep was far away. His phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from journalists, CEOs, even strangers pouring in their thanks, their outrage, their solidarity. Yet beneath all the noise, Elias felt a stillness, a recognition that something irreversible had shifted. Rachel Morgan had insisted on riding in the vehicle behind his, not wanting to leave the circle of safety until she knew he was settled. Maya Lopez's stream had finally ended, but not before millions had tuned in. Daniel Price, ever the lawyer, had already begun drafting the first outlines of legal pathways, careful and methodical. But Elias's thoughts drifted elsewhere, to his mother, who had once told him when he was a boy, "Never give away your seat, Eli. Not the one in class, not the one at the table, not the one in your own heart. If you paid for it, if you earned it, it's yours. Never let anyone make you smaller." He had thought she meant only metaphor, but tonight those words had become flesh, as real as the leather seat beneath him. Leah Okoro, seated beside him, studied his silence. "What's on your mind?" He gave a soft, weary smile. "My mother. Her words. How right she was. But how tired I am of her being right." Leah's eyes softened. "Tiredness is allowed. You carried a weight tonight that should have been shared by the system long before you boarded that plane." The car slowed outside a hotel, press still buzzing at the entrance. Security ushered him through back corridors until finally he stood in the quiet of a suite overlooking Elliott Bay. The room was pristine, sterile, but the silence was what he craved. He set his phone down deliberately, turning it face down on the table. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply breathe. The hum of the city outside became a lullaby, but just as his shoulders began to ease, his mind conjured images of Tom Bradley's pale face when corporate stripped his authority, of Margaret Hill's unraveling composure as the cabin rejected her accusations. He didn't feel triumph. Not exactly. What he felt was the heaviness of knowing that people like them would not disappear overnight. The next flight, the next boardroom, the next restaurant prejudice would still linger, waiting for silence to shield it again. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. When Elias opened it, Rachel stood there, her uniform slightly wrinkled, eyes tired but intent. "I just wanted to see you were all right," she said simply. He gestured her in. "All right is relative, but I'm here." Rachel lowered herself into a chair, her posture slumping for the first time all night. "I've worked for Atlantic Horizon for 8 years. I've seen microaggressions, bad attitudes, even outright harassment. I told myself I couldn't fix it, so I just stayed quiet. Tonight, I kept thinking, if I stay quiet again, I'll lose myself. So thank you, Elias, for giving me courage by refusing to move." He met her gaze, his voice low. "You don't owe me thanks, but you owe yourself honesty, and you chose it. That matters more than you know." Rachel's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Will you keep fighting, even when the cameras go away?" Elias exhaled slowly. "I don't think I have a choice anymore. Not because I want the spotlight, but because I've seen what silence costs. Tonight taught me that when one person holds their ground, others find the strength to stand too. That can't end at the jet bridge." Rachel nodded, as if receiving a charge, then quietly excused herself. Elias returned to the window. Staring at the bay until dawn painted the water in streaks of gold. By morning, the headlines had multiplied. Editorials praised his calm. Critics questioned whether social media mobs had too much power. Civil rights groups demanded deeper reforms. And through it all, Atlantic Horizon scrambled to prove their promises weren't hollow. Helen Voss announced sweeping changes, new training programs, revised authority limits, and a passenger dignity charter. Still, Elias' new policies on paper were only as strong as the people enforcing them. Change required more than signatures. It required conviction. Later that week, he stood at a press podium, not as a victim, but as a leader. Cameras whirred, pens scratched, but he spoke with the same even cadence he had used that night in the cabin. "I was asked to give up my seat," he began. "But the truth is, what was really being asked was for me to give up my place as an equal, as a paying customer, as a human being who belonged in that cabin as much as anyone else. Too many of us have been asked to give up our place in schools, in workplaces, in our very communities. Too often, silence has let those requests become demands. I refused, and I'll keep refusing, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been told to move aside. Tonight I ask you, what seat are you being asked to surrender, and how will you answer?" The room erupted in applause, but Elias didn't smile for the cameras. He smiled faintly at the memory of his mother's words, at the thought that maybe, somewhere, a child would hear his and find courage for their own battles. That evening, as he walked alone along the waterfront, he finally allowed himself a quiet laugh. Not of joy exactly, but of recognition. He had not sought this storm, but perhaps it had sought him for a reason. Above him, the sky stretched vast and unbroken, airplanes tracing silver lines against the horizon. He watched one disappear into the clouds and whispered under his breath, almost like a prayer, "Every seat has a story. Tonight, mine stayed mine." The story of Elias Carter isn't only about a seat on an airplane. It's about the seats we all hold in life. Too often, we are asked to give them up, our place in line, our voice in meetings, our dignity in daily interactions. Many stay silent, believing it's easier to yield than to resist. But silence carries its own cost. Elias's refusal to move wasn't an act of defiance for the sake of pride. It was a quiet stand for fairness, a reminder that respect is not a luxury, but a right. His calm courage inspired strangers to speak up, exposed abuse of authority, and forced an entire corporation to confront its failures. For older generations especially, this story resonates as both a warning and a hope. It reminds us that prejudice, though persistent, is not immovable. And it shows that change often begins in the smallest moments when one person refuses to surrender their place. In our own lives, we may not face an airplane cabin full of witnesses, but we all face crossroads where dignity is tested. May we choose to hold our ground, not only for ourselves, but for those who come after us. Thank you for sharing your time with us and walking through this powerful story. If it touched your heart, please show your support like this video. Share it with others who need to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire reflection and hope. Your voice and presence matter here.